Tonight, a memo obtained by Axios shows the 4 talking points that Republicans say they are going to use in their defense of Donald Trump in the public hearings. The July 25th call summary, the best evidence of the conversation, shows no conditionality or evidence of pressure. President Zelensky and President Trump have both said there was no pressure on the call. The Ukrainian government was not aware of a hold on U.S. security assistance at the time of the July 25th call. Too bad that's already been proven untrue. And President Trump met with President Zelensky, and U.S. security assistance flowed to Ukraine in September 2019, both of which occurred without Ukraine investigating President Trump's political rivals. Joining us now is David Jolly, a former Republican member of Congress from Florida. He's an MSNBC political analyst. David, are you surprised by your former colleague's approach to the public hearing, according to the leaked memo tonight?
I am not, nor am I surprised that it's largely inaccurate, because, as you mentioned, Lawrence, all of the corroborating testimony of witnesses suggests that, in fact, there was this orchestrated scheme, and Ukraine was aware of it, even to the extent of U.S. diplomatic personnel drafting statements for Zelensky to read. What is interesting in this, though, is each of their 4 arguments seems to play into a broader theme that they're going to argue there was no quid pro quo. And that's an inflection point for Democrats to have to make a strategic decision, because I would make the case no quid pro quo was required. It certainly didn't need to be felt by Ukraine, but the act of asking Ukraine to investigate the Bidens in and of itself, even without a quid pro quo, was impeachable behavior by the President of the United States. The Republicans' 4 arguments are all trying to undermine a quid pro quo argument. Corroborating evidence will overcome it, but Democrats will have to make a decision. Do they require quid pro quo to move an impeachment article or not?
Yeah, it's so clear that it's the solicitation that is the violation. That's right. And that's all you need is the solicitation. And the solicitation doesn't have to be rewarded with action by the other side that you've solicited it from. It's all right there in solicitation. But this is one of those arguments where it sounds to me, David, like the Republicans are just going to keep saying the thing, whatever that thing is. And they don't care whether it's true or not. And they don't care whether it's just been refuted by a witness. They just need to say it. So that's the piece of video that Fox News can use.
Yeah, Lawrence, neither the facts nor the founders are on the Republican side in this impeachment inquiry. We know that we will hear on Wednesday there was a quid pro quo, that Rudy Giuliani was a personal representative of the president, not a diplomatic representative of the State Department. And we will know that, and we will learn that there was a direct line to the West Wing, to Mick Mulvaney and to Donald Trump from Ambassador Sondland. The facts are not on the Republican side. Neither are the founders. James Madison worried when they were writing the impeachment clause a president would engage with a foreign power, engage in deceit. George Mason was worried a president would try to interfere with an election. This is exactly the presidency that the founders feared. And so what we will hear from Republicans is not an argument about the facts or about the founders' view of impeachment. It will be geared towards a Republican reelection strategy in 2020, this grievance politics that Republicans are victims. This will be about keeping their base and ensuring there's no erosion of Republican voters in 2020.
And, David, I expect we're going to see all sorts of parliamentary disruption, point of order, Mr. Chairman, interruptions, objecting to questions, every little thing they can think of. They're going to turn this into as much of a circus as they can. David Jolly, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.